So welcome everybody this morning to the INKY 2020 seminar series Research Bites. And I'm Andrea Osborne, and I'm going to be in the background controlling the slides. And I'd like to just ask you to type any questions you may have for Jasmine into the chat function, and I will relay those to her at the end of the meeting. If you have any questions or issues, again, use the chat function to send comments to myself. It should show up as my name or as host. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Anna Lang to introduce Jasmine, our speaker today.
Hello, everyone. Jasmine Dhillon is our presenter today. She is a Senior Advisor, Veterinary Epidemiologist for the Animal Disease Surveillance Animal Health Science Directorate of the CFIA. She's also Executive Director for Veterinarians Abroad Supporting and Teaching, and an adjunct professor with the Department of Ecosystem and Public Health at the University of Calgary. Those of us who know her understand her love of Alberta and cattle, since she grew up on a working beef ranch. Jasmine completed her Bachelor of Science in Zoology and Physical Anthropology and her BEd prior to obtaining her DVM from the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. She spent time locuming in mixed practice and working for the Canadian Global Food Animal Residue Avoidance Data Bank while completing a Master's of Public Health, specializing in epidemiology and infectious zoonotic disease. Her PhD in epidemiology was based on studying dog population management and dog bite prevention in remote indigenous communities. Jasmine has been an instructor and lecturer for various undergraduate DVM courses, including evidence-based medicine, epidemiology, study design, risk analysis and economics, reportable and foreign animal diseases, and public health emergencies. She has experience providing guidance and support for disease surveillance and education on disease outbreak prevention. In addition to being a qualified EMT, Jasmine is a passionate supporter of One Health. She is an advocate of global responsibility and is involved with Vets Without Borders. She most recently spent 2.5 weeks in Nepal teaching a series of workshops to farmers and 5 weeks analyzing data in New Zealand looking at antimicrobial use and resistance in livestock. Jasmine, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. That was a very thorough introduction. I am really honored to actually be here. I hadn't actually expected to do a presentation for INKY this year, so this is a bit of a pleasure. So the whole issue with food insecurity in the North is a very enormous topic that we could actually spend weeks discussing. And so I'm going to just give a bit of a brief overview of some of the basic problems before we discuss the topic of endemic zoonoses and the issues surrounding surveillance. Next slide, please. So food security is a major issue in many different areas in the world. And it's considered to be the inability to acquire or consume an adequate diet, quality, or sufficient quantity of food in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that you're actually going to be able to do so. So household food insecurity is frequently linked with the household's financial ability to access adequate food. And according to the FAO, food security exists if all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Next slide, please. So in Canada, food security presents as a growing challenge in our northern and remote Aboriginal communities. So over the last 10 years, we've found that off-reserve and on-reserve Indigenous households are more than twice as likely as other Canadian households to be food insecure, and that they experience food insecurity at a rate more than double of other non-Aboriginal households. So approximately 27% versus 12%. Recent data actually indicates that Canadian households with children have an even higher prevalence of food insecurity than those without children. And that's a considerable concern when we take a look at the fact that food and the ability to ensure that you actually have a full stomach continues to affect things such as the ability to focus, the ability to learn, the ability to have cognitive and academic success, and psychosocial development. In addition, food insecurity is known to cause individuals to be more susceptible to malnutrition and infection, as well as chronic health problems such as obesity, anemia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stress, amongst others. And when you also consider that our Indigenous populations continue to have a very deep relationship with the environment and the resources it provides, as well as the harvesting, sharing, and consumption of traditional foods, that actually has a tremendous effect on their psychosocial and mental well-being. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, even though there has been increasing focus on our food stability and food insecurity within Canada over the last couple of decades, we seem to be having an increasing problem. And this has an overall ongoing effect with regards to how all of those individuals actually are capable of interacting and creating sustainable programs and developing ongoing success with respect to the economy and politics, and dealing with different aspects of processes such as colonialism and environmental dispossession. Next slide. So when you first start to take a look at the issues surrounding food insecurity, there are a variety of things that initially leap out and really seem to be the major problems, such as the remote geography, the diverse, different geography in the north, of an enormous diversity of socio-cultural groups, the ongoing poverty and lower income levels within the north, as well as a variety of other things such as climatic effects and such. Next slide, please. But in our Indigenous communities, it's considerably more complicated, because beyond the price of things like groceries, food security becomes a complex issue of the human health and well-being that requires multiple different solutions. And to understand food security in our northern Indigenous environments, there needs to be a very people-centered approach that looks at multiple different factors influencing life, such as the environmental changes that actually pose a threat to the traditional or country food sources, and the then effect on wildlife abundance and the ability for the fishermen to actually go out on the ice floes, or for hunters to actually track wildlife. So all of these, plus all of the other effects, actually have a considerable effect on the logistics of whether or not there is the ability to maintain an adequate food source, which means that individuals then turn to store-bought food, which frequently has far lower nutritional value than other foods and are far more expensive. And although the idea is that doing the hunter-gathering and the going out and getting traditional foods is going to be considerably cheaper, it actually ends up frequently being far more expensive when you take into account the need for either oil and gas to power any of your engines, or the need to maintain the health and well-being of your dog sled teams and all of the extra equipment, et cetera, which are affected by the reduced amount of money that you actually have because you're having to supplement your traditional food with the store-bought food. So these food shortages can actually cause some significant issues throughout entire communities. And this becomes just an increasing challenge when we think about the advent of ongoing climate change, leaving northern communities in increasingly precarious positions. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about climate change, I've already mentioned a few of these things, but we look at things like changing migration patterns, the increased competition for food, both amongst the animals being hunted, but also amongst various communities, the potential for there to be waterborne diseases as the waters warm up and various pathogens are capable of surviving, in addition to the addition of new pathogens. For example, Dr. Susan Coutts noted 3 new nematode species being found in muskoxen up in the far north. And then as well, those climate change is affecting the unpredictable and early breakup of the sea ice, making it difficult to actually plan when the hunters are able to go on to the land, and higher winds and dangerous travel conditions either affecting both travel across terrestrial areas, but also within the water. So all of those have a major effect, leading to a dramatic effect then when we take a look at the inability to provide adequate surveillance. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the wide variety of potential endemic zoonotic diseases, these include things like tularemia, which can be found in muskrats, beavers, rabbits, rabies, and I've just named canids, but obviously they can be found in other diverse species. Brucellosis, which affects multiple different ungulates, foxes, bears, echinococcal, which gets transmitted via either rodents or canids, trichinosis from walruses and polar bears, crypto from both marine and terrestrial mammals, tuberculosis, which I didn't even name all the different species that potentially we can find it in, but basically it's most mammals, and then other foodborne illnesses that are capable of being transmitted due, such as salmonella and CAMP, due to either eating food raw or eating it not completely cooked. So all of these are considerably widespread, as well as being found in a wide variety of species. Now, the problem is most of, when we're talking about traditional foods, most of this is in wildlife. And wildlife actually ends up falling into a bit of a gap when it comes to surveillance, because although these animals are then being eaten as part of the overall nutritional and daily food, it doesn't fall in neatly into the package of domestic livestock. So then it doesn't necessarily end up being under the purview of the CFIA, but it doesn't necessarily also then fall under either Environment Canada or under Parks Canada. And so when attempting to develop surveillance programs, it ends up needing to be a very collaborative, holistic approach that includes provincial, territorial, federal government programs, and involving multiple different groups at the table. At this point in time, unfortunately, there hasn't necessarily been the holistic engagement with the various different indigenous groups to provide the traditional knowledge and the background that would also then help to provide an overall more successful surveillance program. Partly, it has to do with the wide disparity with regards to various different groups, both socioculturally and geographic distance, but also the various different shifting priorities within different governments. And so this then leads to the surveillance issues falling into a bit of a black hole sometimes when we don't end up being able to focus on these paramount priorities. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a few of these gaps already. So both the inadequate surveillance and knowledge of what the potential disease spread and prevalence are, inadequate funding for education and development of sustainable programs. And one of the big things that has been shown to be a success is if you actually educate the either the producer or the hunter, whomever it is who is actually out dealing with the animals, at how to recognize diseases early on so that they can actually have a more successful outcome. And especially in situations where their livelihood or their health and well-being are affected in a very positive way, it provides the ability for them to then provide traditional knowledge exchange and feedback so that way they can teach the next generation. There have been examples of that done with teaching the different hunters how to recognize both trichinella and the joint issues that are discovered with brucellosis. And so then they will either submit samples for testing to pop-up labs, or they can send them in to various different labs within the government. Unfortunately, if that is the requirement, the distance that frequently is required in order to get things sent in sometimes then has a major effect on the quality of the sample, which limits the ability for full testing. So creating other opportunities would definitely be something to look to. And then I already mentioned the changing priorities. And next slide, please. So there are a number of recommendations that various groups have had with respect to improving the overall ability to deal with some of these endemic zoonoses, such as development of a more holistic surveillance system, supporting the local food systems, such as harvesters. So if you actually provide the funding for these groups frequently they have already established means and ways of assessing whether or not animals are healthy or not. Sustainable wildlife management of healthy herds, so the culling of those sick animals, and then submission of those animals in for testing to determine what the overall prevalence of disease are. Ensuring that there's sound economic development within communities so that communities have sustainable money coming in so that they're able to actually buy extra food as necessary without actually limiting their ability to go and do their traditional hunts and the access for their local food. This then leads to various poverty reduction strategies so that you can actually develop different businesses and that kind of thing within the various communities. Ensuring that there's stable funding between different governments and different elections in order to make sure that anything that is developed continues to be funded on an ongoing basis so that there are no shifting priorities and that there is a sustainable disease testing procedure left in place. And then I already mentioned the support for educational programs on surveillance for a wide variety of the community. Next slide, please. So this is just a list of the references that I used, and there's a wide variety of different groups that are currently working on ameliorating food security in the North. ARCINEC is one of them, and so the background pictures that I've used throughout the presentation actually come from one of their annual reports. Next slide, please. And I really loved this quote from one of the different annual reports that has been done on the North. So overall, it's important to recognize the fact that our northern communities really have a very holistic approach, and any development, any system, any surveillance that's put into place needs to actually account for that, because otherwise it's going to end up doomed to fail. And last slide. So thank you all. I don't really necessarily think that I am the expert on this, and there are a number of people I know on the call who actually have far more background and knowledge on this. For example, Heather Fenton, who is one of the wildlife veterinarians up in the Northwest Territories, I think managed to make it onto the call, as did one of my mentors, Dr. Ted Layton. So we'll open it up at this point for either discussion or questions, and thank you all for listening.
Jasmine, we do have one question in the chat already. So how does the list of endemic zoonoses line up with the diseases seen in the human population? Is there transmission?
Very, very closely, yes. So I actually included only the list of endemic zoonoses where there have been human cases. So there are other diseases that are found within the wildlife population, but unless there was a human case, I didn't actually include it in the list.
Okay. If anybody has additional questions, you can type them in the chat.
I guess one of the things, sorry, I actually ended up getting a question here, Andrea.
Okay, good. Good.
So the question is whether or not there are an equal number of endemic zoonoses in aquatic animals. And aquatic animals, yes, there are a fair number of zoonotic diseases that are transmitted there as well. Unfortunately, my expertise is not on the aquatic side, so I only know what I've read in reports. One of the major issues, as with any coastal population, is obviously with fish and shellfish and some of the toxins and contaminants that can occur in them, as well as for a number of the marine animals. What's happened is, such as with the bowhead whale, there's been severe depletion. So while zoonotic diseases may not be as well studied in those animals, we do know that there have been some significant issues with the aquatic animals that have led also to some food insecurity.
Another question, Jasmine. Is there coordination with public health authorities on these endemic zoonoses?
I actually think that that's probably something that I should ask Heather if she's on the phone, because she would have a better answer to that. But I do know that overall there probably is a far better collaboration between public health and agriculture or wildlife health in our northern communities than there is in the rest of Canada, simply because they tend to be far more closely linked. Heather, are you there? If you are, it's *6 to unmute yourself. Okay, she maybe fell off.
Yeah. I don't see her on the list any longer, Jasmine, so she must have had to leave.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jasmine?
It doesn't have to be a question. Potentially it could be a comment, right? So if you have anything that you'd like to add.
It's Anne here. It takes me too long to type, so I'm just going to ask it. What are our concerns with rising food insecurity and the impact on air travel? We know that getting supplies to the north is limited by weather at the best of times, given that air travel is disrupted significantly at this point, and many airlines are likely going to be suffering financial difficulties. Are public and or agricultural agencies looking at how to stabilize the food shipments at this time to the north?
That's a really good question, Anne. So one of the biggest issues in some of our northern communities is always access, right? So the ability to actually get there. And so some communities are only accessible by plane, or when the ice floes are actually open, there might be some ability to get there by boat. But with some of the changing climate issues, where it means that there's melting ice and the ice thickness is significantly decreased, the ice-free season is extending, that has caused problems, in addition to the fact, of course, the expense of oil or generators and that kind of thing to actually make sure that freezers stay cold over the summer periods, so that food that needs to be kept, because it's perishable, kept cold, isn't necessarily going to be able to be kept as cold without it being very, very expensive. And so this is something that is being looked at. It has been acknowledged and recognized, but to date, there have not been sustainable options sort of set forward.
So we're right at 12:30. So unless there's any urgent questions or comments, I think we'll say thank you so much, Jasmine. That was a fantastic presentation. And the recordings will be shared of the presentation, posted on the INKY Facebook and linked into Twitter, as well as on the CAS website. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for a great presentation. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Make sure you stay safe and don't forget to wash your hands.